I stood in the center of the million-dollar foyer, absolutely drenched in freezing soapy water, wondering if this was the exact moment the most beautiful woman I had ever met was going to fire me. Welcome back to the channel. If you love dramatic, heart-racing GL stories that keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and comment down below what you think will happen next. Your support helps bring more of these stories to life. Now let's get into it. Part 1: The Unbreakable Nanny. The eviction notice on my apartment door was the final straw. My bank account was practically laughing at me, displaying a number so low it barely qualified as currency. I had spent the last 2 months desperately searching for a job that could keep a roof over my head, but everything was a dead end. That was until I saw the listing. It was a nanny position for a wealthy family in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city. The pay wasn't just good, it was life-changing. It was the kind of money that could wipe out my debt, pay my rent for a year, and actually allow me to breathe. The catch? The listing had been posted and taken down 4 times in the last 6 months. Whoever these kids were, they had a reputation for breaking their caretakers. But I, Harper Brooks, was officially out of options and too stubborn to be broken. The following morning, I pulled my beat-up sedan up to a set of massive wrought iron gates. After buzzing in, I drove up a winding driveway lined with immaculate oak trees until I reached a breathtaking modern estate. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress of glass and stone. I took a deep breath, smoothing down my best, albeit cheap, blazer and marched up to the oversized oak front door. Before I could even knock, the door swung open. My breath caught in my throat. Standing before me was, without a doubt, the most striking woman I had ever seen in my life. She looked to be in her late 30s, dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal pantsuit that hugged her frame perfectly. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon, but it was her eyes that pinned me in place, a piercing, icy blue that seemed to look right through my carefully constructed facade. "You must be Harper," she said, her voice smooth, authoritative, and sending an unexpected shiver straight down my spine. "Yes, ma'am," I replied, instantly wishing I hadn't used the word ma'am. "Thank you so much for the opportunity." "Save the pleasantries, please," she interrupted, stepping aside to let me in. "I'm Eleanor Vance. My time is extremely limited, and frankly, I don't want to get attached to you. You're the 5th nanny I've interviewed this season, and if my children have anything to say about it, you won't last the week. Follow me." I blinked, momentarily stunned by her bluntness, but hurried to follow her clipping heels across the sprawling, marble-floored foyer. The house was magnificent, filled with modern art and minimalist furniture, but it felt cold. It lacked the warmth of a home. Eleanor led me into a massive, sunlit kitchen. She poured herself a cup of black coffee, her movements precise and graceful. I couldn't help but stare at the elegant line of her neck and the slight tension in her shoulders. She was carrying the weight of the world, and she wore it like armor. "Let me be completely transparent, Harper," Eleanor said, leaning against the marble island and crossing her arms. "I am the CEO of a major tech firm. I work 70 hours a week. I need someone to manage my household and, more importantly, my 2 children, Jackson, who is 10, and Chloe, who is 7. Since their father walked out on us 3 years ago, they have made it their life's mission to terrorize anyone I hire. They will test you. They will lie to you. They will try to break you." She uncrossed her arms and stepped closer to me. The scent of her perfume, something expensive involving jasmine and sandalwood, wafted over me, making my heart do a strange, completely unprofessional flutter. "I need someone who will not run away crying when things get difficult," Eleanor said, her icy blue eyes locking onto mine, searching for any sign of weakness. "Can you handle that, Harper? Or should we end this interview right now?" I stood my ground, refusing to break eye contact. The intensity radiating from her was intoxicating. "Ms. Vance, I've dealt with much worse than a couple of rebellious kids. I need this job, and I don't scare easily. I won't quit. I promise you that." For a fraction of a second, the ice in Eleanor's eyes seemed to melt, replaced by a flicker of genuine surprise and perhaps something else. A faint smirk played on her perfectly painted lips. "We'll see about that. You're hired. Start tomorrow at 7 a.m. The next morning, I arrived at the estate ready for war. Eleanor had already left for the office, leaving me a perfectly typed schedule on the kitchen counter. My first task: wake the children and get them down for breakfast. I made my way up the grand sweeping staircase and found Jackson's room. I knocked softly. No answer. I pushed the door open. "Good morning, Jackson, I'm..." Flush. A bucket perched precariously on the top of the doorframe tipped over perfectly, sending a massive wave of freezing cold, soapy water crashing down onto my head. I gasped, the shock of the ice-cold liquid stealing my breath as it soaked completely through my clothes, ruining my shirt and dripping into my eyes. From the corner of the room, a 10-year-old boy with a mop of brown hair and a triumphant smirk stood holding a video game controller. Next to him, a 7-year-old girl with pigtails giggled behind her hands. "You must be the new nanny," Jackson said, stepping forward with an obnoxious amount of confidence. "I'm Jackson. This is Chloe. And you're standing in a puddle. You can leave your keys on the counter on your way out." I stood there for a moment, water dripping from my nose, my hair plastered to my face. 5 other women had probably screamed, cried, or immediately called Eleanor. 5 other women had packed their bags. I looked at Jackson. I looked at Chloe. And then, despite the freezing water soaking into my socks, I started to laugh. It wasn't a nervous laugh, it was a genuine, deep belly laugh. Kids' smug expressions instantly vanished, replaced by utter confusion. They exchanged a bewildered glance. "Wow," I said, wiping a blob of soap from my cheek. Classic bucket over the door trick. 10 out of 10 for execution, but a little cliché on the creativity, don't you think? If you really wanted to get me, you should have mixed in some glitter. It never washes out. Jackson frowned, crossing his arms. "You're supposed to be mad. You're supposed to yell at us and quit." "Sorry to disappoint you, kiddo," I said, wringing out the hem of my shirt, maintaining a cheerful tone. "But it's going to take a lot more than a little soap to get rid of me. Now I'm going to go dry off. By the time I get back, I expect you both downstairs for pancakes. And Jackson, you're mopping this up." I turned on my heel, squishing my way down the hallway, leaving 2 completely baffled children in my wake. I felt a surge of victory. I had won the first battle. I found a guest bathroom, grabbed some towels, and began drying my hair and trying to salvage my soaked shirt. I was shivering, but I couldn't wipe the smile off my face. I was actually enjoying this. Suddenly, I heard the heavy thud of the front door opening and closing downstairs. Then, a sharp, familiar voice echoed up the stairs. "Harper? Jackson? What in the world is going on here?" It was Eleanor. She was home early. My heart leaped into my throat. I grabbed a dry towel, wrapped it around my shoulders, and hurried to the top of the stairs. Eleanor was standing in the foyer, her briefcase dropped by the door, staring at the trail of soapy water leading from the stairs to the kitchen. She looked furious. "Miss Vance," I called out, jogging down the stairs, still dripping slightly. "Everything is completely under control." Eleanor's eyes snapped to me, taking in my drenched appearance, my ruined clothes, and the towel draped over my shoulders. Her jaw tightened, the furious expression deepening. "I leave for 2 hours, Eleanor said, her voice dangerously low. 2 hours, Harper. And I come back to my house looking like a water park. I assume Jackson did this?" "It was just a little welcoming prank," I said quickly, closing the distance between us. "Really, it's fine. I'm handling it." "No, it is not fine," Eleanor snapped, stepping toward me. The space between us suddenly felt very small. "This is exactly what I warned you about. I do not have the time or the patience to deal with this constant rebellion. I thought you said you could handle them. If you're going to let them walk all over you on day one, then maybe I made a mistake. She reached out, grabbing the edge of the towel draped over my shoulder, intending to pull it tighter around me. But as her fingers brushed against my bare collarbone, time seemed to stop entirely. Eleanor froze. Her breath hitched just slightly, and her icy blue eyes widened as they locked onto mine. The anger in her expression instantly evaporated, replaced by something entirely different, something vulnerable, shocked, and intensely aware. We stood there in the center of the foyer, the silence deafening, her hands still gripping the towel against my skin. I could feel the heat radiating from her touch, a sharp contrast to the cold water soaking my clothes. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, so loud I was terrified she could hear it. I couldn't look away from her. I didn't want to. For the first time since I walked through those doors, the formidable Eleanor Vance looked completely and utterly lost for words. "Mom!" Jackson's voice broke the spell. Eleanor snatched her hand away as if she had been burned, taking a hurried step back, clearing her throat and smoothing down her immaculate suit jacket. I forced myself to look away, my cheeks burning hotly. We will discuss this later, Harper," Eleanor said, her voice suddenly a little breathless, refusing to meet my eyes again. "Get changed. Then come to my office." She turned and walked swiftly down the hall, leaving me standing in the foyer, wet, shivering, and acutely aware that this nanny job was going to be infinitely more complicated and dangerous than I had ever imagined. End of Part 1. Part 2, The Rules of Engagement. I retreated to the small, beautifully furnished suite at the back of the house that had been designated as my quarters. I peeled off the freezing, soap-soaked clothes, threw on a dry pair of jeans and a crisp white button-down shirt, and vigorously towel-dried my hair. Despite the chill still lingering in my bones, my skin felt oddly flushed. My collarbone, where Eleanor's fingers had momentarily grazed against my skin, practically hummed with phantom warmth. I stared at myself in the bathroom mirror, taking a deep breath to steady my racing pulse. "Get a grip, Harper," I scolded my reflection. "She is your boss. She is a powerhouse CEO who could ruin your life with a snap of her manicured fingers. And she is completely, utterly unattainable." Shaking off the lingering shock of that intense, silent moment in the foyer, I made my way through the labyrinthine corridors to Eleanor's home office. The door was heavy mahogany, slightly ajar. I knocked twice, the sound echoing in the quiet hallway. "Come in," her voice called out, sharp and composed, betraying none of the vulnerability I had witnessed just 15 minutes ago. I pushed the door open. The office was a testament to Eleanor Vance's success. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive modern glass desk, and large bay windows overlooking a meticulously landscaped garden. Eleanor sat behind the desk, her posture rigidly perfect, a pair of sleek reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose as she reviewed a stack of documents. She didn't look up immediately, letting the silence stretch in a classic power move. "Ms. Vance," I said, keeping my voice even and professional. She finally raised her head, taking off her glasses and resting them on the glass surface. Her icy blue eyes swept over my dry clothes, her expression unreadable. "Have a seat, Harper." I sat in one of the leather chairs opposite her. "Let me be incredibly clear," Eleanor began, folding her hands together on the desk. "What happened downstairs is unacceptable. I hired you to maintain order, not to turn my house into a comedy routine. If Jackson and Chloe believe they can humiliate you without severe consequences, you have already lost control of this household." "With all due respect, Ms. Vance," I countered, sitting up straighter, "if I had lost my temper, screamed at them, and dragged them to you for punishment, I would have lost. That is exactly the reaction they wanted. It's what every other nanny gave them before packing their bags." Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly, her jaw tensing. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by her employees. "And your alternative was to laugh with them?" "My alternative was to show them that their tactics won't work on me," I explained smoothly. "Children like Jackson and Chloe act out because they want to feel in control of their environment, especially when they feel their personal lives are out of their hands. They wanted to break me. By not breaking, I took their power away. And Jackson is currently downstairs mopping the floor. Consequence delivered without the screaming match. Eleanor stared at me for a long, silent moment. The intense, evaluating gaze made me feel completely exposed, yet I refused to break eye contact. I watched the slight furrow between her brows, the subtle shift in her brilliant blue eyes as she processed my words. "You are very confident for someone who has been here for less than 24 hours, she finally murmured, her voice losing a fraction of its icy edge. "I have to be," I replied simply. "Otherwise, they'll eat me alive." A heavy silence settled over the room. The air between us felt charged, thick with unspoken words and an undeniable magnetic tension that I was trying desperately to ignore. Eleanor looked down at her hands, taking a slow breath before meeting my gaze again. "Fine," Eleanor said, her tone professional once more. "I will let you handle the children your way. For now. But I expect a full report on their behavior by the end of the week. If your unconventional methods fail, we will revert to strict discipline." "Understood. Understood." "You may go," she said, pulling a document toward her and dismissing me. As I stood up and turned toward the door, her voice stopped me. "And Harper?" I looked back. Eleanor wasn't looking at the document. She was looking right at me, a strange, complex emotion flickering in her eyes. "Thank you. For not quitting." I offered a small, genuine smile. "I told you, Miss Vance. I don't scare easily." I left the office feeling like I had just survived a high-stakes negotiation. Returning to the kitchen, I found a sullen Jackson pushing a mop around a massive puddle of soapy water, while Chloe sat at the island, swinging her legs and watching him. "You missed a spot," I noted casually, leaning against the doorframe. Jackson glared at me, his cheeks flushed with frustration. "This is stupid. We have a cleaning lady for this." "Maria is here to clean the house, Jackson, not to clean up your premeditated traps," I said, walking over and inspecting his work. "Actions have consequences. You wanted a water show, you get to be the janitor. Finish up. Chloe, can you help me set the table for breakfast?" Chloe blinked, surprised that I wasn't ignoring her. She hopped off the stool, her pigtails bouncing. "What are we having?" "Blueberry pancakes," I said, opening the industrial-sized refrigerator. "And if your brother finishes before they get cold, he can have some too." The rest of the day was a delicate game of chess. Kids were cautious, unsure of how to deal with an adult who didn't react with blind rage or immediate surrender. They tried a few minor acts of rebellion, Chloe refusing to do her math worksheet, Jackson trying to sneak his tablet to the dinner table, but I met each challenge with calm, unshakable boundaries. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten to call their mother. I simply enforced the rules with a pleasant, immovable stubbornness. By the time 8:30 p.m. rolled around, both kids were surprisingly in bed, exhausted from a day of actually following a schedule. The massive estate was eerily quiet at night. I walked down to the kitchen, the soft glow of the under-cabinet lighting illuminating the spotless marble counters. My muscles ached, and I was mentally drained, but I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Day one was in the books. I put a kettle on the stove, desperate for a cup of chamomile tea to calm my wired nerves. As the water began to boil, I heard the faint, muffled sound of footsteps approaching. I turned to see Eleanor walking into the kitchen. The armor was completely gone. She had traded her tailored suit for a pair of loose silk pajama pants and a simple gray tank top. Her dark hair, usually pinned in a severe bun, cascaded down her shoulders in soft, natural waves. Without the harsh office lighting and the intimidating posture, she looked softer, younger, and heartbreakingly beautiful. She paused when she saw me, looking slightly startled. "Harper, I thought you'd be asleep." "Just making some tea," I said, my voice coming out a little huskier than I intended. "Would you like a cup?" Eleanor hesitated, glancing toward the hallway as if considering retreating to her room, before letting out a soft sigh and stepping fully into the kitchen. "Please." "That sounds wonderful. She sat at the island, resting her elbows on the marble and burying her face in her hands for a moment. She looked completely exhausted. I poured the hot water into 2 mugs, dropping a tea bag into each, and slid one across the counter toward her. "Rough day?" I asked gently, taking a sip from my own mug. Eleanor let out a dry, humorless laugh, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. "You have no idea. The board of directors is pushing for an acquisition I know is a mistake. The press is hounding my PR team, and I feel like I'm failing at everything." She stopped abruptly, looking up at me with a flash of panic, as if shocked she had just admitted that out loud. "I apologize. That was entirely unprofessional. You don't need to hear about my corporate nightmares." "It's okay," I said softly, stepping a little closer to the island. "You don't always have to be the CEO in your own home, Miss Vance." "Eleanor," she corrected quietly, her blue eyes locking onto mine. "When it's just us, you can call me Eleanor." My breath caught in my throat. "Eleanor," I tested the name. Felt dangerous on my tongue. "How were they today?" she asked, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "The children." "They were kids," I replied honestly. "They pushed boundaries. They tested me. But they went to bed on time and they finished their homework. They're hurting, Eleanor. They just want someone who won't leave them." Eleanor looked down at her tea, a profound sadness washing over her beautiful features. "Their father, he didn't just leave me. He abandoned them. He moved to Europe with his 25-year-old assistant and never looked back. I've tried to make up for it by giving them everything, by working to secure their future, but I know I'm not here enough. I know they hate me for it." "They don't hate you," I said fiercely, leaning forward. "They love you. They're just angry and they don't know where to direct it." Eleanor looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. The vulnerability in her gaze pulled at something deep inside my chest. Without thinking, I reached out across the marble island. As my hand moved toward hers, she simultaneously reached for her mug. Our hands collided. Skin met skin. Touch was electric, sending a jolt of pure, unadulterated heat straight up my arm. Neither of us pulled away. My fingers lightly brushed against her knuckles. Eleanor's breath hitched, her eyes widening, the pupils dilating in the dim kitchen light. The silence in the room became incredibly heavy, charged with a magnetic pull that was pulling me closer to her, erasing the boundaries of employer and employee, of logic and reason. She looked from our hands up to my lips, and the air between us practically ignited. End of Part 2. Part 3, The Fragile Truce. The silence in the kitchen was absolute, save for the soft humming of the refrigerator and the frantic, echoing rhythm of my own heartbeat. For a suspended eternity, Eleanor's hand remained frozen beneath mine on the cool marble of the kitchen island. The air between us was incredibly thin, thick with an unspoken, forbidden electricity that made my skin tingle. She looked at my lips, and a flush crept up her elegant neck, painting her pale skin in shades of deep rose. Then, reality crashed back into the room like a shattering pane of glass. Eleanor practically ripped her hand away, stepping back so quickly her stool scraped harshly against the floor tiles. The sudden movement broke the spell entirely. She wrapped her arms around herself, defensively, her eyes wide and suddenly filled with a swirling storm of panic and realization. I should go to bed," Eleanor stammered, her voice lacking its usual commanding authority. It was a breathless, fragile sound. "It's late. Tomorrow is a demanding day." "Eleanor, I started, taking a half step forward, but I caught myself. What was I going to say? Sorry I touched you? Sorry I want to do it again?" "Good night, Harper," she interrupted, not looking at me. She turned on her heel and practically fled the kitchen, the soft swish of her silk pajama pants the only sound left in her wake. I stood alone in the dim light, my hands still resting on the counter where hers had been just seconds before. The phantom warmth of her skin lingered on my fingertips. I pressed my hands to my face, letting out a long, shaky breath. "You are going to lose this job," my brain warned me. You are going to ruin everything if you don't build a wall right now. But as I walked back to my quarters, I knew the wall was already crumbling. The following week was a masterclass in avoidance. Eleanor was a ghost in her own home. She left for the office before 6:30 a.m. and returned well past my bedtime. We communicated exclusively through sterile, typed notes left on the kitchen counter and brief text messages regarding the children's schedules. It was clear she was building distance, constructing a fortress around herself to prevent whatever had almost happened in the kitchen from ever occurring again. While Eleanor pulled away, my relationship with Jackson and Chloe began to unexpectedly bloom. The turning point happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Jackson had a massive science project due the next morning, a structural bridge made entirely of popsicle sticks and wood glue. When I found him in the living room, he was surrounded by a pile of snapped wood, his face buried in his arms, silently crying. Chloe was sitting nearby, looking distressed but unsure of how to help. Previous nannies would have either done the project for him to avoid a tantrum or scolded him for leaving it until the last minute. Instead, I sat down on the rug right beside him. "Structural collapse?" I asked softly. He sniffled, wiping his nose with the back of his sleeve, trying desperately to hide his tears. "It's stupid. It won't hold the weight. Keeps leaning to the left and breaking. I'm going to fail, and Mom is going to be so mad because she paid for all the extra supplies." "Hey," I said, gently nudging his shoulder with mine. "We don't fail in this house. We just find a different way to build. Do you know what the strongest shape in architecture is?" Jackson looked at me, his red-rimmed eyes skeptical. "A square." "A triangle," I corrected, grabbing 3 unbroken sticks and forming the shape on the carpet. "Triangles distribute weight evenly. You've been building with squares. If we add triangular supports to your base, this bridge could probably hold a brick." For the next 4 hours, the 3 of us sat on the floor of the massive, formal living room. I didn't do the work for him, I guided him. Chloe handed us sticks and acted as the glue inspector. We got sticky, we laughed, and slowly the impossible bridge took shape. By the time we finished, it was a sturdy, impressive structure. Jackson beamed, a real, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "Thank you, Harper," he muttered, looking down at his masterpiece. It was the first time he had said my name without a sneer. "You did the work, kiddo," I smiled, ruffling his hair. "I just showed you the triangles." Unbeknownst to us, Eleanor had come home early. I only realized she was there when I stood up to stretch my aching back and saw her standing in the arched doorway of the living room. She was wearing a stunning emerald green trench coat, her briefcase hanging limply from her hand. She wasn't glaring and she wasn't rushing. She was just watching us, completely still. Her eyes moved from the bridge to Jackson's smiling face to Chloe, who was currently trying to peel dried wood glue off her palm, and finally to me. The look on her face was devastating. It was a cocktail of profound relief, overwhelming gratitude, and a bone-deep, heartbreaking loneliness. She was witnessing a family moment in her own house, and she felt like an outsider looking in. "Mom," Jackson called out, finally noticing her. "Look." Harper showed me how to use triangles. "It can hold 10 pounds now." Eleanor blinked rapidly, composing herself in a fraction of a second. The formidable CEO mask slipped back into place, but her eyes remained remarkably soft. She walked into the room, setting her briefcase down. "It looks incredibly structurally sound, Jackson," she said, her voice warm. "I'm very proud of you." She looked at me, the air between us suddenly vibrating with that familiar, dangerous tension. "Thank you, Harper." "For assisting him." "It was a team effort," I replied, my voice a little quieter than normal. I couldn't tear my eyes away from hers. The avoidance of the past week felt utterly useless when she was standing right in front of me. "Children, go wash up for dinner," Eleanor instructed, not breaking our gaze. Once they scampered off, the massive living room felt intimately small. Eleanor took a step closer to me. The scent of her jasmine and sandalwood perfume enveloped me, making my pulse spike. "You managed to get my son to willingly complete a project without a screaming match," she noted, her voice low. "You are full of surprises." "I just listen to them, Eleanor," I said gently. "They just want to be heard." She sighed a tired, heavy sound and reached up to rub her temples. "I have the annual tech industry gala tonight. I am supposed to give a keynote speech in 3 hours, and I feel entirely unprepared. I am representing the company, dealing with hostile investors, and I can barely focus." It was a rare admission of weakness. She was letting me in just a fraction of an inch, and I wanted nothing more than to push the door wide open. "You are going to be brilliant," I told her, putting every ounce of conviction I possessed into my words. "You are Eleanor Vance. You built an empire. A room full of men in suits is nothing compared to what you handle before breakfast." A small, genuine smile tugged at the corner of her lips. It was a beautiful sight. "You have a dangerous amount of faith in me, Harper." Just calling it like I see it. 2 hours later, the house was quiet again. Kids were occupied with a movie in the media room, and I was in the kitchen preparing a light snack for them. Suddenly, the intercom on the wall buzzed. "Harper!" Eleanor's voice came through the speaker, sounding uncharacteristically frantic. "Could you come up to my room, please?" Immediately. My heart jumped into my throat. I abandoned the sliced apples and practically ran up the grand staircase. I had never been to Eleanor's private quarters before. I reached her door and knocked. "Come in!" I opened the door and stepped into a sprawling, elegant master suite decorated in deep blues and silvers. But I barely noticed the decor. My breath completely abandoned me at the sight of her. Eleanor was standing in front of a full-length mirror. She was wearing a floor-length backless gown made of midnight blue silk that hugged every curve of her body flawlessly. It was the most breathtaking thing I had ever seen. But the woman wearing it looked entirely distressed. "I cannot get this ridiculous clasp," Eleanor said, holding up a delicate, intricate diamond necklace. Her hands were visibly shaking. "My fingers won't cooperate. I am going to be late and my driver is waiting." "Hey, it's okay. Breathe," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I walked across the plush carpet until I was standing directly behind her. Proximity was intoxicating. Her bare back was completely exposed, the smooth, pale skin practically glowing in the soft light of the bedroom. "May I?" I asked, holding out my hands. Eleanor looked at me through the mirror. Her blue eyes were dark, dilated, and intensely focused on my reflection. She gave a small, jerky nod. I took the cold diamond necklace from her shaking hands. I stepped in closer until there was barely an inch of air between my chest and her exposed back. I could feel the heat radiating from her body. I carefully draped the necklace around her neck. My knuckles brushed lightly against her collarbone, and I heard her breath hitch sharply in the quiet room. My hands were remarkably steady as I fumbled with the tiny clasp at the nape of her neck. Every time my fingers grazed her skin, a shiver visibly ran down her spine. The silence in the room was deafening, filled only by the sound of our ragged breathing. "There," I whispered, finally securing the clasp. My hands dropped, but I didn't step back. I couldn't. I was anchored to her gravity. Eleanor didn't move away either. She slowly turned around to face me. We were so close that the silk of her gown brushed against my jeans. She looked up at me, the panic about the gala entirely gone, replaced by a raw, burning intensity that sent a shockwave straight to my core. She tilted her head up, her gaze dropping to my lips. "Harper," she breathed, her voice a fragile, desperate whisper. End of Part 3. Part 4, The Midnight Confession. The air in the bedroom was entirely depleted of oxygen. We were standing so close that the delicate midnight blue silk of Eleanor's gown rustled softly against the denim of my jeans with every ragged breath we took. Her eyes, usually a sharp and commanding icy blue, were now dark, searching, and filled with a desperate kind of vulnerability that I had never seen before. She had spoken my name like a prayer, a fragile whisper that completely unspooled the last of my self-control. I slowly lifted my hand, my fingers trembling slightly as they traced the line of her jaw. Her skin was incredibly soft, and she leaned into my touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a fraction of a second. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me. She is your boss. This is a mistake. You are going to ruin everything. But as I looked down at her lips, slightly parted and trembling, every logical thought evaporated into thin air. I leaned in. The distance between us closed to a mere fraction of an inch. I could feel the warmth of her breath ghosting across my mouth. Bzzzzz. 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 The sharp, abrasive buzzing of the intercom on the bedside table shattered the silence like a gunshot. Eleanor gasped, her eyes snapping open. She took a massive step backward, stumbling slightly on the plush carpet. The spell wasn't just broken, it was violently shattered. The air in the room instantly dropped 10 degrees, and the suffocating reality of who we were and what we were about to do crashed down upon us. Ms. Vance, the polite, filtered voice of the estate security guard echoed from the speaker. Your driver is waiting at the front gate. Eleanor stared at me, her chest heaving, her face flushed a deep, panicked crimson. She looked terrified, not of the intercom but of herself. Of us. I have to go, she stammered, her voice completely devoid of its usual power. She turned away, hurriedly grabbing a silver clutch from the dresser. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped it. Eleanor, I started, my voice thick with unshed adrenaline and heavy regret. Wait. We should. No, she cut me off, holding up a hand without looking back. We shouldn't. I am late, Harper. Please ensure the children are in bed by 9. Before I could say another word, she swept past me, the scent of jasmine and sandalwood trailing in her wake as she practically fled her own bedroom. I stood there alone, the echo of the heavy oak door clicking shut ringing in my ears. I squeezed my eyes shut and let out a long, frustrated groan, running my hands through my hair. I had crossed a massive line. And now I had no idea if I still had a job. The rest of the evening felt like moving underwater. I went downstairs and found Jackson and Chloe in the media room, deeply engrossed in an animated movie. I made them popcorn and sat on the oversized leather sofa, but my mind was miles away, trapped in that midnight blue bedroom. At 8 o'clock my phone buzzed. It was a news alert. Out of morbid curiosity, I opened the local business news stream on the television. Tech CEO Eleanor Vance stuns at annual innovation gala. Camera panned across a grand, crystal-lit ballroom, zooming in on the podium. And there she was. Eleanor stood before a crowd of hundreds of men in expensive suits. The panic I had seen in her eyes an hour ago was entirely gone. She was magnificent. She spoke with a commanding, unwavering authority, her brilliant mind on full display as she outlined the future of her company. She looked powerful, untouchable, and completely out of my league. Is that Mom? Chloe asked, rubbing her tired eyes and pointing at the screen. Yeah, Bug, I smiled softly, pulling a blanket over her. That's your mom. Jackson watched the screen, his expression unreadable. She always looks different on TV. Like she's not a real person. Like she's just a boss. I looked at the young boy, recognizing the deep ache in his voice. She has to be a boss out there, Jackson. People rely on her. Thousands of people have jobs because she works so hard. But she does it for you. Everything she builds to make sure you and your sister are safe. Jackson didn't argue. He just watched the screen for another minute before leaning his head against my shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world. Can we go to bed now, Harper? You got it, kiddo. By the time the house was finally silent, it was nearing midnight. Outside, a heavy summer storm had rolled in, rain violently lashing against the massive glass windows of the estate. Thunder rumbled in the distance. I was pacing the kitchen floor, a cold cup of tea in my hands, unable to sleep. I was terrified of what would happen when she returned. Would she fire me on the spot? Would she pretend it never happened? At 1:15 a.m., I heard the heavy thud of the front door opening and closing, followed by the soft padding of bare feet. I held my breath as Eleanor walked into the kitchen. She looked exhausted. The silver clutch was gone, and she was carrying her impossibly high heels in one hand. The flawless chignon had fallen apart, leaving dark, wavy strands framing her pale face. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw me standing by the marble island. "Harper," she said, her voice a mixture of surprise and profound weariness. "Why are you still awake?" "I couldn't sleep," I replied honestly, setting my mug down. "I wanted to make sure you got home safe in this weather." "How was the speech?" Eleanor walked slowly to the refrigerator, pulling out a bottle of sparkling water. She avoided my gaze completely. "It was fine. The board was appeased. The stock will likely rise on Monday." She poured herself a glass, her hands gripping the marble edge of the counter as she leaned against it, staring out the window into the pitch-black, rainy night. The silence stretched between us, thick, heavy, and suffocating. The elephant in the room was crushing us both. "Eleanor," I said softly, taking a step toward her. "Don't," she whispered, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the counter. "Please, Harper. Just go to bed." "I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen," I said, my voice gaining strength. I took another step closer. "I'm not going to ignore the fact that you were trembling upstairs. I'm not going to ignore the way you looked at me." Eleanor spun around, her blue eyes blazing with a sudden defensive fury. "You are my employee. You live in my house to care for my children. Do you have any idea what would happen if anyone found out? The press? My investors? My ex-husband would use it as ammunition to drag me through a custody battle just for sport. I'm not asking for a press release, Eleanor." I argued back, closing the distance until I was standing right in front of her. "I'm just asking you to look at me and tell me I'm crazy. Tell me you didn't feel it. Tell me to pack my bags right now, and I will walk out that door and you will never see me again." She stared at me, her chest heaving, the anger in her eyes warring with an agonizing, desperate longing. The rain battered against the glass beside us, matching the chaotic rhythm of my heart. "Tell me to leave, Eleanor," I whispered, holding my ground. She opened her mouth, her lips trembling, but no words came out. Tears she had been holding back for years suddenly pooled in her eyes, making them shine like shattered glass. She looked so incredibly tired of fighting, so tired of being strong for everyone else. "I can't," she finally choked out, a single tear escaping and sliding down her cheek. "God help me, I can't let you go." Before I could even process the words, Eleanor closed the final inches between us. Her hands, cold and trembling, reached up and grabbed the lapels of my shirt, pulling me fiercely against her. Our lips crashed together. It wasn't a gentle, tentative kiss. It was an explosion. It was years of repressed emotion, unbearable stress, and denied desires colliding all at once. My hands immediately flew to her waist, pulling her flush against my body. She tasted like expensive champagne and something distinctly, intoxicatingly her. She tangled one hand into my hair, her mouth moving against mine with a desperate, frantic hunger that sent shockwaves of fire straight through my veins. I kissed her back with everything I had, backing her up until her spine hit the edge of the marble island. She let out a soft, breathless moan against my lips, a sound that completely short-circuited my brain. The world outside the kitchen, the estate, the company, the children, the rules, all ceased to exist. There was only the heat of her body, the frantic beating of our hearts, and the overwhelming realization that I was falling hopelessly in love with Eleanor Vance. For a solid minute, we were entirely lost in each other, drowning in the feeling we had both been fighting since the moment she opened the front door on my first day. But as quickly as the fire ignited, the cold water of reality poured over it. Eleanor suddenly pulled away, breaking the kiss with a sharp, ragged gasp. She pushed against my chest, putting distance between us. Her eyes were wide, terrified, and filled with instant regret. She touched her swollen lips with trembling fingers, looking at me as if she had just committed a terrible crime. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "No, this is wrong. This is a mistake. I am ruining everything." "Eleanor, wait, it's not." "I have to go," she interrupted, practically tripping over her own feet as she backed away from me. "I can't do this. I can't." She turned and ran out of the kitchen. I didn't follow her. I stood completely frozen in the dim light of the under-cabinet LEDs, the storm raging outside, my lips still tingling from the most incredible kiss of my life, knowing with absolute certainty that this fragile truce had just escalated into an all-out war of the heart. End of Part 4. Part 5, The Unwelcome Return. The morning sun felt excessively bright, piercing through the gaps in my heavy blackout curtains and stabbing me directly in the eyes. I hadn't slept a single wink. Every time I closed my eyes, I was transported back to the dim kitchen, the smell of rain and jasmine, the frantic heat of Eleanor's skin, the desperate, intoxicating taste of her lips against mine. And then, the crushing weight of her immediate, terrified retreat. I dragged myself out of bed and into the shower, letting the hot water run over my tired muscles. I was bracing myself for the inevitable. Eleanor Vance was a woman of logic, control, and absolute order. What happened between us was the antithesis of all those things. I fully expected to walk into the kitchen and find a severance check waiting on the marble island, along with a polite, legally vetted letter of termination. I dressed quickly, throwing on my standard uniform of dark jeans and a comfortable sweater, and made my long walk down the corridor. My stomach was tied in 1,000 agonizing knots. Kitchen was empty. There was no severance check, but there was a note resting precisely in the center of the counter, written in Eleanor's sharp, elegant handwriting. "Harper, I have early meetings and will be working late at the office. Please take the children to the museum for their afternoon outing. Maria will handle dinner prep. E. Not a single mention of last night. Not a termination, but a total, absolute withdrawal. She was running, retreating back into her fortress of corporate armor and impenetrable schedules. I sighed, crumpling the note and tossing it into the recycling bin. Fine. If she wanted to play it this way, I would give her space. But I wasn't going to quit. I was too invested now, not just in her but in the 2 children sleeping upstairs. By 10 a.m. the house was alive. Jackson and Chloe were surprisingly cooperative, eating their oatmeal without the usual theatrics. "So, the Natural History Museum," I announced, wiping a smudge of cinnamon off Chloe's cheek. "Who wants to see the T-Rex skeleton?" "I want to see the space exhibit," Jackson mumbled, poking at his bowl. "But whatever. It's better than sitting here all day." It was a small victory, but I would take it. The afternoon at the museum was genuinely wonderful. Away from the echoing halls of the massive estate, Jackson and Chloe acted like normal kids. We spent hours wandering through the exhibits. I bought them ridiculously overpriced astronaut ice cream at the gift shop, and for a few hours the crushing anxiety of my complicated relationship with their mother faded into the background. We arrived back at the estate around 4 p.m. I parked my beat-up sedan in the sweeping driveway, unbuckling Chloe from her booster seat. As we walked up the stone steps toward the front doors, my blood instantly ran cold. There was a sleek silver Porsche parked haphazardly near the fountain, a car that definitely did not belong to Eleanor. Before I could even put my key in the lock, the heavy oak door swung open. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked like he had stepped out of a luxury watch commercial. He was tall, with perfectly coiffed blonde hair, a designer suit worn without a tie, and an arrogant, easy smile that didn't quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. Jackson stopped dead in his tracks on the steps. The astronaut ice cream he had been holding slipped from his fingers, hitting the stone with a dull thud. Chloe immediately hid behind my legs, clutching the fabric of my jeans in a white-knuckle grip. "Well, well, well," the man drawled, his gaze sweeping over me with a mixture of dismissive amusement and clear condescension. "You must be the new hired help. I have to say, Eleanor's standards have certainly shifted." I didn't need an introduction to know exactly who this man was. The toxic, suffocating aura he projected gave it away instantly. "Richard," Jackson whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and deeply rooted anger. He didn't say Dad. He said Richard. "Hello, Jackson," Richard said smoothly, not moving to hug his son. He barely even looked at Chloe, who was trembling against my leg. "Is your mother here?" I let myself in with my old code. Surprised she hasn't changed it yet. Sentimentality, perhaps. "Miss Vance is at the office," I said, my voice dangerously even. I instinctively took a step forward, placing my body squarely between this man and the children. I could feel my maternal instincts I didn't even know I possessed, flaring up like a 5-alarm fire. "And if you aren't expected, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Richard laughed. It was a sharp, unpleasant sound. "Look at you, playing the guard dog. I am Jackson and Chloe's father. This is my house, or at least it was. I have every right to be here." "Actually, sir," I countered, keeping my chin high and my gaze locked onto his, "legally, this is Eleanor's private residence, and unless you have a scheduled visitation, you are currently trespassing. Now, please step out of the doorway." Richard's amused smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine, ugly anger. He took a step toward me, trying to use his height to intimidate me. "Do you have any idea who you're speaking to, little girl? I could have you fired with one phone call." "I'd love to see you try," I shot back without missing a beat. I didn't flinch. I didn't back down. "Jackson, take your sister to the media room. Now." Jackson hesitated for a fraction of a second before grabbing Chloe's hand and pulling her past Richard, slipping into the house and disappearing down the hallway. Once the kids were out of sight, my absolute sole focus was getting this parasite off the property. "Get out," I commanded, my voice dropping an octave. "I'm not leaving until I speak to my ex-wife," Richard sneered, crossing his arms and leaning against the doorframe, trying to reclaim his air of superiority. "I need her signature on some asset restructuring documents. And frankly, I want to see the look on her face when she realizes I'm moving back to the States." My stomach dropped. Moving back. The absolute last thing Eleanor needed right now was her narcissistic ex-husband returning to torment her and destabilize the children she was trying so desperately to protect. Suddenly, the familiar sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway broke the tense standoff. A sleek black town car pulled up behind my sedan. The back door opened and Eleanor stepped out. She was wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit, her phone pressed to her ear, deep in conversation. But the moment she looked up and saw Richard standing in her doorway, she froze entirely. The phone slowly lowered from her ear. I watched from the steps as all the color drained from her beautiful face, leaving her looking fragile and utterly terrified. "Eleanor, darling," Richard called out smoothly, stepping out onto the porch. "You're looking tense. Rough day at the office?" Eleanor didn't speak. She looked at Richard, and then her eyes darted to me, silently asking a million questions. "Are the kids safe? Why is he here? What did he do?" I gave her a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "They are safe. I handled it." Taking a deep, unsteady breath, Eleanor straightened her spine, pulling her impenetrable CEO armor around her like a physical shield. She marched up the steps, her heels clicking sharply against the stone. "Richard," she said, her voice dripping with ice. "What are you doing here? You lost your right to drop by unannounced 3 years ago." "Just needed a few signatures, Elle," he said casually, pulling a folded document from his inside jacket pocket. "And I wanted to see the kids. Though it seems your new nanny has them under lock and key. She's remarkably hostile." "Harper's job is to protect my children," Eleanor said sharply, stepping onto the porch. She moved instinctively closer to me, forming a united physical front against him. And clearly, she is doing it flawlessly. Hand me the papers. Richard held the documents just out of her reach, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. You know, seeing you like this, so strung out, leaving the kids with hired help who disrespects their own father. It makes me wonder if you're really fit to have sole custody, Eleanor. Now that I'm moving back to the city, maybe it's time we reevaluated our arrangement. Eleanor flinched. It was barely noticeable, but standing this close to her, I felt the immediate vibrating tension shoot through her body. He had hit her absolute weakest point. He was threatening to take away the only thing she truly cared about. You abandoned them, Richard, Eleanor whispered, her voice shaking slightly despite her best efforts. You have no grounds. With my lawyers? And your documented 70-hour work weeks? Richard smirked, finally handing her the papers. I can buy any grounds I want. Sign them, Elle. I'll be in touch. He turned, shooting me one last sneering look, before descending the steps and climbing into his flashy sports car. We stood on the porch in silence, listening to the roar of the engine as he sped down the driveway and out of the gates. The moment the car disappeared, Eleanor's armor completely shattered. She dropped the documents onto the stone porch as if they burned her. Her hands flew to her face, and a ragged, gasping sob tore from her throat. Her knees buckled. Eleanor! I lunged forward, catching her by the shoulders before she could collapse onto the hard stone. She leaned heavily into my arms, completely abandoning her pride. I wrapped my arms around her waist, pulling her tight against my chest, supporting her weight. She buried her face into the crook of my neck, her body shaking with violent, suppressed sobs. The scent of her perfume and the sheer, heartbreaking vulnerability of the moment overwhelmed my senses. He's going to take them, Harper, she choked out against my collarbone, her fingers digging desperately into the fabric of my sweater. He's going to drag me through court, and he's going to take my children just to punish me. No, he's not, I said fiercely, wrapping my arms tighter around her, resting my chin on top of her soft, dark hair. I didn't care about boundaries. I didn't care about professionalism. I only cared about protecting the woman crying in my arms. I won't let him. We won't let him. Do you hear me? Eleanor didn't pull away. Despite the terror of the moment, she pressed closer, holding on to me like I was the only solid thing left in her rapidly crumbling world. Kiss from last night hung heavy in the air between us, no longer a mistake, but an undeniable promise of exactly how far I was willing to go for her. End of Part 5. Part 6, The War Council. The chill of the late afternoon breeze swept across the stone porch, but I barely felt it. My entire universe had narrowed down to the woman shaking violently in my arms. Eleanor Vance, the untouchable CEO, the woman who commanded boardrooms and terrified investors, was currently clinging to my sweater like a lifeline, her tears soaking through the fabric at my collarbone. "Breathe, Eleanor," I murmured, keeping my voice low and steady, rubbing a soothing circle into the tense muscles of her back. "Just breathe. He's gone. He's not here anymore." Took several long minutes for the harsh, ragged sobs to subside into shallow, shaky breaths. Slowly, the fight-or-flight adrenaline that had hijacked her nervous system began to wane, leaving her completely depleted. She pulled back slightly, her hands resting flat against my chest. Her blue eyes were bloodshot, her immaculate makeup ruined, yet in the soft, fading light of the afternoon I had never found her more breathtaking. I am so sorry," she stammered, frantically wiping at her cheeks with the back of her hand, stepping out of my embrace. The sudden loss of her warmth left an immediate ache in my chest. She looked down at the crumpled legal documents resting on the stone floor, her expression hardening. "This is wildly inappropriate. You are my employee. You should not have to witness." "Stop," I interrupted, reaching down to pick up the papers before she could. I folded them and held them firmly in my hand. "Do not do that, Eleanor. Do not put the wall back up. Not right now and definitely not with me. I told you I am not going anywhere. She looked up at me, her defenses crumbling just as quickly as she had tried to rebuild them. The agonizing vulnerability in her eyes was a stark reminder of the desperate, passionate kiss we had shared the night before in the kitchen. She wasn't just my boss anymore, and we both knew it. "Come inside," I said gently, placing a hand on the small of her back. The heat of my palm seemed to ground her. "Let's get you out of the cold." I guided her through the heavy oak doors and into the sprawling, silent foyer. The house felt different now. Before, it had been a fortress. Now it felt like a castle under siege. "I need to check on the children," Eleanor said, her voice hoarse, attempting to smooth down her ruined suit jacket. "Let me do it," I offered, stopping her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Richard spooked them. If they see you this upset, it's only going to validate their fear. Go up to your room. Take off the suit. Wash your face. I'll make sure they're okay, and then I will bring you a cup of tea in the study. We will figure this out together." Eleanor hesitated, her maternal instinct warring with her sheer physical exhaustion. Finally, she nodded, a silent surrender. The study. 10 minutes. As she ascended the grand staircase, looking heavier and more burdened than I had ever seen her, I took a deep breath, steeling my own nerves. I had a job to do. I found Jackson and Chloe in the media room exactly where I had sent them. The massive television was off. Chloe was curled into a tight ball on the far corner of the velvet sofa, clutching a throw pillow to her chest. Jackson was pacing in front of the unlit fireplace, his small fists clenched at his sides, trying so hard to look brave. "Hey, guys," I said softly, stepping into the room and leaving the door open. Jackson stopped pacing, his eyes darting to the hallway behind me. "Is he gone? Is Mom okay?" "He's gone," I confirmed, walking over and sitting on the edge of the coffee table so I was at their eye level. "Your mom is perfectly fine. She's just changing out of her work clothes. Can't come back inside, Jackson. I promise." "He said he's moving back," Jackson blurted out, his voice cracking, betraying the tough guy facade. "He said he wants to evaluate the arrangement. That means he wants to take us, Harper. He doesn't even like us. He just wants to make Mom cry." The sheer accuracy of the 10-year-old's emotional intelligence broke my heart. I reached out, gently pulling Jackson by the wrist until he gave in and collapsed onto the sofa next to his sister. I wrapped an arm around each of them, pulling them into a tight, secure hug. "Listen to me, both of you," I said, my tone completely serious. "Your mother is the strongest person I have ever met. She fights absolute giants every single day at her company and wins. Do you really think she's going to let Richard walk in here and take you away?" Chloe sniffled, looking up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. "But he has lawyers. And your mom has a whole army behind her," I said fiercely. "And she has me. We are not going to let him disrupt your lives. This is your home. You are safe here. But your mom needs you to be brave for her right now, okay? She needs to know that you trust her to protect you." Jackson wiped his nose, his jaw setting in a stubborn line that mirrored Eleanor's perfectly. "I'm not leaving this house. If he tries to take us, I'll bite him." I let out a surprised, watery laugh, kissing the top of his head. "Let's save the biting as a plan B. For now, how about we order the biggest, greasiest pepperoni pizza in the city for dinner?" 30 minutes later, with the kids successfully distracted by a mountain of pizza and a comedy movie, I made my way to Eleanor's study. The room was bathed in the warm, golden glow of a single desk lamp. Eleanor was sitting on the plush leather sofa in the corner, her legs pulled up underneath her. She had changed into a pair of soft gray sweatpants and a massive, oversized cashmere sweater that looked like it belonged to someone much larger, perhaps a remnant of a past life she hadn't quite thrown away. Her face was scrubbed clean of makeup, making her look strikingly young and devastatingly tired. I set a steaming mug of chamomile tea on the low table in front of her, along with the folded legal documents. I didn't ask for permission. I simply sat down on the sofa right next to her, close enough that our knees brushed. Eleanor didn't move away. She picked up the tea, letting the steam warm her face. "They're okay," I told her quietly. "They're eating pizza in the media room. Jackson threatened to bite Richard if he comes back." A weak, fragile smile tugged at the corner of Eleanor's lips. "He gets that from my side of the family." The silence settled over us, heavy but no longer suffocating. It was a shared, intimate quiet. "I read the papers," I confessed, nodding toward the documents on the table. "I know I shouldn't have, but I needed to know what we were dealing with. He's demanding full legal and physical custody, claiming your work schedule constitutes neglect." Eleanor closed her eyes, resting her head back against the leather cushions. "It's a textbook extortion tactic. He doesn't want to raise them, Harper. He wants to leverage them, so I will hand over a larger percentage of my shares in the company. He knows I would burn my empire to the ground before I let him take my children." "Then we fight him," I said simply, shifting on the sofa so I could fully face her. "We document everything. We show the courts that the children have a stable, loving environment here. We prove that his sudden interest is financially motivated." Eleanor opened her eyes, turning her head to look at me. Proximity was intoxicating, but the raw honesty in her gaze was even more powerful. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice laced with genuine confusion. "You have been here for barely 2 weeks. I have been nothing but difficult. My children tried to terrorize you. My ex-husband is a monster, and I kissed you, and then I ran away like a coward. You should be packing your bags, Harper. You should be running as far away from this mess as possible." "I think we both know I'm not going anywhere, Eleanor," I replied, my voice dropping to a soft, husky timbre. I slowly reached out, my fingers gently tracing the line of her wrist where it rested on her knee. A visible shiver ran through her body at my touch. "Last night," she breathed, her eyes locking onto mine, the air between us suddenly thickening with that undeniable magnetic tension. I panicked. I have spent the last 3 years controlling every single variable in my life. And then you walked through my front door and suddenly I couldn't breathe properly. I couldn't think straight. When I kissed you, I realized I had zero control over how much I wanted you. And that terrified me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild, frantic rhythm. Hearing her admit it, hearing the brilliant, powerful Eleanor Vance confess that I unraveled her, was the most intoxicating thing I had ever experienced. "You don't always have to be in control, Eleanor," I whispered, sliding my hand up her arm, my thumb lightly brushing against the soft cashmere at her shoulder. "You're allowed to let go. You're allowed to let someone else carry the weight for a minute." Eleanor's breath hitched. She looked at my lips, the same desperate hunger from the night before flaring to life in the depths of her icy blue eyes. The fear was still there, lurking in the shadows of the impending custody battle, but the desire was stronger. "I don't know how to do this," she confessed, a fragile whisper that broke my heart and stitched it back together all at once. "Then let me show you," I murmured, leaning in. This time she didn't run. Eleanor closed the final fraction of an inch between us, her lips meeting mine in a soft, agonizingly tender kiss. It wasn't frantic like the night in the kitchen. It was deliberate, deep, and profoundly intimate. She let out a soft sigh, her hands coming up to cradle my face, her thumbs tracing my cheekbones as if memorizing my features. I wrapped my arms securely around her waist, pulling her flush against me on the leather sofa. She practically melted into my embrace, the rigid tension finally leaving her spine. Kiss deepened, a slow, intoxicating exploration that tasted of chamomile tea and absolute surrender. Every brush of her lips, every sigh, felt like a silent vow. We were standing on the edge of a massive, terrifying cliff with the custody battle looming over us, but in this room, in this exact second, we were invincible. When we finally pulled apart, completely breathless, Eleanor rested her forehead against mine. Her eyes were dark, dilated, and free of the panic that had haunted her all day. "We fight," she whispered against my lips, her voice steady and resolute. "We fight," I agreed, pressing one last firm kiss to her mouth. "And we win." End of Part 6. Part 7, The Gathering Storm. The morning after a revolution always feels unnervingly quiet. When I woke up the next day, the heavy storm that had battered the estate had completely passed, leaving behind a crisp, painfully bright morning. I lay in bed for a long moment, staring at the ceiling, my lips still holding the phantom warmth of Eleanor's kiss. We had crossed the Rubicon. There was no going back to the polite, sterile dynamic of boss and employee. We were in this together, and while my heart felt lighter than it had in years, a cold, heavy knot of dread sat firmly in the pit of my stomach. Richard had declared war, and in wars there were always casualties. I dressed quickly in my usual dark jeans and a neat button-down shirt, mentally preparing myself for the day. When I walked into the kitchen, the air was already thick with the scent of dark roast coffee and impending conflict. Eleanor was standing at the marble island, dressed in a formidable razor-sharp white suit. She looked like a general preparing for battle. Arrayed across the counter were stacks of legal documents, financial portfolios, and 3 open laptops. Standing across from her was a striking woman with silver hair pulled into a tight French twist, wearing a tailored navy dress that screamed exorbitant hourly rates. "Harper," Eleanor said, her voice steady and professional as she looked up. But the moment our eyes met, a microscopic shift occurred. The icy blue thawed for just a fraction of a second, a silent, intimate acknowledgement of everything that had happened in the study last night. "This is Victoria Sterling, my lead counsel. Victoria, this is Harper Brooks, the children's nanny." Victoria didn't smile. She evaluated me with a sweeping, predatory gaze that made me feel entirely transparent. "Ms. Brooks, Eleanor has informed me of your spirited interaction with her ex-husband yesterday." "I was doing my job, Miss Sterling," I replied smoothly, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "He was trespassing and upsetting the children." "Be that as it may," Victoria said, turning her sharp attention back to Eleanor. "We cannot afford any wild-card variables, Eleanor. Richard's strategy is clear. He is going to paint you as an absentee mother who outsources her parenting to the hired help. He wants to prove that you are unfit so he can secure a controlling interest in your assets via child support and custody." Eleanor's jaw tightened, her hands resting flat on the marble. "He doesn't care about the children, Victoria. He didn't even look at Chloe yesterday. The court doesn't care about his genuine affection, Eleanor. They care about optics," Victoria snapped, tapping a manicured fingernail against a legal pad. "For the next 6 months, you are living in a glass house. Richard is going to hire private investigators. He's going to scrutinize every penny you spend, every hour you work, and every person who walks through those gates. You need to be the picture of traditional, flawless domesticity." Victoria leaned forward, her voice dropping to a serious, warning tone. "That means no scandals, Eleanor. No erratic behavior. And absolutely no romantic entanglements. If Richard even suspects you have a new partner, especially someone who could be deemed a disruption to the children's routine, he will use it to tear you apart on the stand. Do you understand?" From across the kitchen, I watched Eleanor's spine turn to steel. She didn't look at me. She couldn't. But I saw the way her knuckles turned white as she gripped the edge of the counter. The secret we had just created in the safety of her study was suddenly a ticking time bomb. "I understand perfectly, Victoria," Eleanor said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "My children are my priority. There are no distractions." "Good," Victoria said, snapping her briefcase shut. "I will file the preliminary injunction to block his immediate custody petition. Keep your head down, Eleanor. And Miss Brooks," I looked at the lawyer. "Yes. Keep the children out of his sight and keep yourself out of the crossfire. If you give him ammunition, he will fire it." With that cheerful parting thought, Victoria swept out of the kitchen, the heavy front door clicking shut behind her. The silence that followed was suffocating. I took a step toward the island, my heart aching at the exhausted slump of Eleanor's shoulders. "She's right, I said softly, keeping my voice low. Eleanor finally looked up, her eyes wide and conflicted. "Harper, about last night." "Don't," I interrupted gently, stepping closer but maintaining a safe, professional distance just in case the children walked in. "Don't apologize. And don't take it back. We knew this wasn't going to be easy. We just have to be smart. We play the game, Eleanor. You be the perfect CEO mother, and I'll be the perfect invisible nanny." "I don't want you to be invisible," she whispered, a sudden, desperate ferocity in her voice. "I am tired of hiding." "We hide now so we can win later," I promised, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "Now, go conquer the board meeting. I have 2 kids to feed and a fortress to protect." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of forced normalcy. I woke Jackson and Chloe, made them a massive breakfast of French toast and strawberries, and completely avoided the topic of their father. We built a blanket fort in the media room, reading books and playing board games. I was determined to make them feel as safe and secure as possible. Around 2 p.m., while the kids were deeply invested in a fiercely competitive game of Monopoly, the estate's intercom buzzed. "Miss Brooks," the security guard at the gate announced. "There is a woman here claiming she has a court mandate to evaluate the premises. A Ms. Beatrice Thorne." My blood ran instantly cold. Richard wasn't wasting any time. He had sent an evaluator while he knew Eleanor was at the office. He wanted to catch the house in chaos. He wanted to catch the kids being raised by the hired help. "Send her up, please," I said, my voice eerily calm. I turned to the kids. "All right, pause the game. We have a guest coming to look at the house. Jackson, remember what we talked about last night? About being brave?" Jackson nodded, his small face hardening into a serious expression that looked exactly like Eleanor's. "I remember." "Good. You guys stay in here and play. Let me handle the talking." I walked into the foyer just as the doorbell rang. I smoothed down my shirt, pasted on a pleasant, unbothered smile, and opened the heavy oak door. Standing on the porch was a severe-looking woman with a clipboard, thick glasses, and a deeply cynical expression. "Miss Vance?" she asked, her tone entirely devoid of warmth. "Ms. Vance is currently on a conference call with her global executive team," I lied flawlessly. "I am Harper, the household manager. How can I help you, Miss Thorne?" Beatrice Thorne narrowed her eyes, stepping into the foyer without being invited. She immediately began scanning the immaculate surroundings like a hawk looking for a dying mouse. "I am a court-appointed evaluator for family services. I am here to conduct a preliminary environmental assessment regarding the custody petition filed by Richard Vance. I need to see the children and I need to see their living conditions." "Of course," I said warmly, gesturing for her to follow me. "We have nothing to hide. The house is entirely child-proofed and maintained to the highest safety standards." For the next 45 minutes, I played the ultimate game of chess. Miss Thorne tried every trick in the book to trip me up. She inspected the kitchen pantries, looking for junk food. She found only organic snacks, fresh fruit, and the meticulous schedule Eleanor had typed up. She checked the children's bedrooms, finding them spotless and filled with educational toys. Finally, she demanded to see the children. I led her into the media room. Jackson and Chloe were sitting perfectly on the rug, laughing together as Jackson handed over colorful Monopoly money. "Children," I said softly. "This is Miss Thorne. She's just visiting for a little bit." Jackson looked up, his eyes briefly flashing with fear before he remembered my words. He stood up politely. "Hello, ma'am. Would you like to play? I'm currently bankrupting my sister." Chloe giggled, entirely unfazed. Miss Thorne actually blinked, taken aback by the well-adjusted, polite behavior of the children her client had painted as neglected and traumatized. She scribbled something furiously on her clipboard. "No, thank you, Jackson. I see you are well occupied. Where is your mother? She's working in her office upstairs, Jackson lied smoothly, not missing a beat. She always comes down at 3 o'clock to have tea with us. Harper just watches us while Mom does her important calls. It was a brilliant, magnificent lie that completely dismantled Richard's narrative. Ms. Thorne looked disappointed, her shoulders sagging slightly as she realized there was no scandal to uncover here today. Very well, she clipped, turning back to me. I will include this in my preliminary report. But this is just the beginning, Ms. Brooks. Inform your employer that we will be in touch. I walked her to the door, watching with immense satisfaction as she drove away in her sensible sedan. We had won the battle, but the war was far from over. When Eleanor returned home at 6 p.m., she looked utterly exhausted, carrying the weight of a 10-hour negotiation on her shoulders. I met her in the foyer, silently taking her briefcase and heavy wool coat. We had a visitor today, I murmured, keeping my voice low as I hung up her coat. Eleanor froze, the color draining from her face. Richard. No. Beatrice Thorne. Court-appointed evaluator. Eleanor let out a shaky breath, her eyes widening in sheer panic. Harper, what happened? I wasn't here. They're going to use that against me. They're going to say I abandoned them. Hey, I said, stepping directly in front of her, forcing her to look at me. Stop. We handled it. Jackson told her you were upstairs working and that you always have tea with them. The house was spotless. Pantries were perfect. She left with exactly 0 ammunition. You are safe. Eleanor stared at me, her chest heaving as she processed the information. The realization that I had protected her family, that I had stood between her children and the legal threat while she was miles away, seemed to shatter the final, fragile barriers of her composure. Without a word, Eleanor reached out, grabbing the front of my shirt and dragging me into the shadowed alcove beneath the grand staircase, out of sight from the rest of the house. Before I could even register the movement, she pressed me back against the cool plaster wall, her mouth crashing down onto mine. It was a kiss born of pure, desperate gratitude and overwhelming relief. All of Victoria Sterling's warnings about scandals and wild card variables instantly evaporated into the dark space between us. I groaned softly, my hands immediately coming up to grip her waist, pulling her flush against my body. Eleanor kissed me like she was starving, her tongue parting my lips, her fingers tangling fiercely in my hair. The danger of getting caught, the threat of Richard's looming presence, only seemed to fuel the intense, consuming fire that raged between us. We were playing a dangerous, reckless game, hiding in the shadows of her million-dollar fortress, risking absolutely everything for the electric, undeniable truth of what we felt for each other. Thank you, she gasped against my lips, her breath hot against my skin as she pressed a trail of fiery kisses down my jawline. Thank you, Harper. I've got you, Eleanor, I breathed, tilting my head back, completely intoxicated by her touch. I've always got you. End of Part 7. Part 8, The Price of Loyalty. The shadowed alcove beneath the grand staircase felt like a world entirely our own, insulated from the terrifying reality of custody battles, ruthless lawyers, and court-appointed evaluators. Eleanor's lips were a desperate, intoxicating plea against mine, her hands gripping the fabric of my shirt as if I were the only anchor keeping her from being swept away by a hurricane. I kissed her back with a fierce, protective devotion, my back pressed against the cold plaster wall, letting her pour all of her fear, exhaustion, and gratitude into the embrace. Harper, she breathed, pulling back just a fraction of an inch, her forehead resting heavily against mine. Her eyes were dark, dilated, and searching my face in the dim light. I don't know what I would do without you. I don't know how I survived before you walked through those doors. You don't have to survive alone anymore, I whispered, my thumbs gently sweeping across her cheekbones, wiping away a stray tear that had escaped her lashes. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. Harper, where are you? Chloe's high-pitched voice echoed from the top of the sweeping staircase, instantly shattering the fragile, stolen moment. Eleanor gasped, practically jumping backward, her eyes wide with sudden panic. She frantically smoothed down her hair and straightened her suit jacket, the formidable CEO mask slamming back into place with practiced, heartbreaking speed. I took a deep, steadying breath, stepping out of the shadows and into the bright light of the foyer just as Chloe's head popped over the mahogany banister. "I'm down here, Bug," I called up, my voice remarkably steady despite the chaotic, frantic rhythm of my heart. "Just helping your mom with her coat." Eleanor refused to look at me. She picked up her briefcase with trembling hands, her knuckles stark white. I will be in my study, Harper. Please ensure the children start their evening reading." Without another word, she walked swiftly down the hallway, the sharp click-clack of her heels echoing like a ticking clock. I watched her go, the phantom warmth of her body still lingering on my skin. We were walking on a razor's edge, balancing precariously between a love that felt entirely inevitable and a legal war that could destroy her family. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in psychological torture. The estate transformed from a home into a highly coordinated military command center. Notorious Sterling, Eleanor's terrifying lead counsel, practically moved into the guest wing. The formal dining room table was perpetually buried under mountains of legal briefs, financial disclosures, and character affidavits. Eleanor was drilled relentlessly. Victoria would pace the room for hours, throwing aggressive, accusatory questions at her, preparing her for the brutal cross-examination Richard's team was undoubtedly crafting. "Why were you in a board meeting when your son had a fever of 101? Do you really think paying a stranger to raise your children makes you a mother? Isn't it true, Ms. Vance, that you care more about your stock options than your daughter's emotional well-being?" I watched from the sidelines, playing the role of the perfect, invisible household manager. I kept Jackson and Chloe completely insulated from the chaos, orchestrating a flawless routine of homework, park visits, and quiet movie nights. Whenever I walked through the dining room to deliver fresh coffee or silent, reassuring glances, my heart broke for Eleanor. She looked exhausted, her cheekbones sharper, the dark circles under her eyes masked by heavy concealer. We couldn't touch. We barely even spoke outside of logistical necessities. With Victoria constantly hovering and the threat of private investigators looming over the property, even a lingering look felt too dangerous. But in the quiet moments, when our hands accidentally brushed while exchanging a coffee mug, or when I caught her staring at me across the kitchen island with a look of profound, agonizing longing, the fire between us burned brighter than ever. The boiling point arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Victoria had mandated a highly specific organic diet for the children, arguing that it would look excellent on the environmental assessment report. Armed with a ridiculously detailed grocery list, I drove my beat-up sedan to the upscale, overpriced organic market across town. I was loading heavy canvas bags of groceries into my trunk in the dim concrete parking garage when I heard the slow, deliberate clapping of hands echoing off the walls. I spun around, instantly on the defensive. Stepping out from behind a concrete pillar was Richard Vance. He was wearing a sleek, tailored trench coat, his blonde hair perfectly coiffed despite the damp weather. The smug, arrogant smile plastered across his face made my blood boil instantly. "Bravo, Harper," Richard drawled, slowly closing the distance between us. "Really, it brings a tear to my eye. The dutiful nanny, fetching organic kale in the rain to protect her employer's fragile reputation. You really are earning that meager paycheck." I slammed the trunk of my car shut, the loud metallic echo ringing in the garage. I didn't flinch. I stood my ground, crossing my arms over my chest. "Are you stalking me now, Richard? Because I'm pretty sure Miss Sterling would love to add harassment to the restraining order she's currently drafting." Richard laughed, a cold, hollow sound that lacked any genuine humor. "Please. I'm just here for a friendly chat. You and I got off on the wrong foot, Harper. I admire your loyalty, I really do. It's a rare trait in the hired help these days." He stopped a few feet away from me, reaching into the inner pocket of his coat. He pulled out a sleek leather checkbook and a silver fountain pen. "But let's be pragmatic," he continued, clicking the pen. "You are a nanny. You make what? $60, maybe $70,000 a year if Eleanor is feeling generous? You drive a car that looks like it's one pothole away from the scrapyard. You're fighting a war that isn't yours, for a woman who will discard you the second this custody battle is over. Don't talk about her, I warned, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. Richard ignored me, uncapping the pen and scribbling across the paper. Eleanor is a sinking ship. She's unstable, she's a workaholic, and she is going to lose those kids. But you don't have to go down with her. He ripped the check from the book and held it out toward me. I didn't move to take it, but I could clearly read the numbers written in bold black ink. $250,000. $250,000, Harper, Richard said smoothly, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. Tax-free. Yours to keep. All you have to do is pack your bags, walk out of that house tonight, and sign a sworn affidavit stating that Eleanor Vance is an emotionally abusive, negligent mother who leaves her children entirely in your care while she pursues her corporate ambitions. I stared at the check. It was more money than I had ever seen in my life. It was a house. It was a clean slate. It was absolute freedom from the crushing debt I had been drowning in for years. I looked up from the paper and met Richard's cold, calculating eyes. You really don't get it, do you? I asked quietly. Everybody has a price, Harper, he smirked. Take the money. Start a new life. Leave Eleanor to face the music. I reached out and plucked the check from his fingers. His smirk widened into a victorious grin. Without breaking eye contact, I gripped the edges of the heavy paper and ripped it violently down the middle. Then I ripped it again. And again. I tossed the shredded confetti of his bribe onto the wet concrete at his expensive leather shoes. Richard's smile vanished instantly, replaced by a dark, ugly fury. My loyalty isn't for sale, I told him, stepping closer until I was firmly in his personal space. I didn't care that he was taller, I wasn't afraid of him. And neither are those children. You don't love Jackson and Chloe. You just hate that Eleanor built an empire without you. You're a pathetic, bitter man, Richard. And if you ever approach me or those kids or Eleanor again, I won't just call Victoria Sterling. I will destroy you myself. I turned on my heel, unlocked my car, and slid into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking violently with adrenaline as I gripped the steering wheel, but I forced myself to carefully reverse and drive out of the garage, leaving him fuming in the rearview mirror. The drive back to the estate felt entirely too long. My heart was pounding frantically against my ribs. Richard was desperate. If he was resorting to massive bribes, it meant he knew he was losing. But it also meant he was willing to play dirty, and a man like Richard Vance had endless resources to drag us through the mud. I had to tell Eleanor. I had to warn Victoria that he was escalating. I pulled up to the massive iron gates, buzzing myself in and speeding up the winding, oak-lined driveway. I left the groceries in the trunk and practically ran up the stone steps, throwing open the heavy front door. Eleanor! I called out, shrugging off my damp jacket. The house was eerily silent. There was no sound of the children playing, no sharp clicking of Victoria's heels. A heavy, oppressive atmosphere hung in the air, thick enough to choke on. I walked quickly toward the formal dining room. The heavy mahogany doors were slightly ajar. I pushed them open and froze. Victoria Sterling was standing at the head of the table, her face devoid of its usual aggressive confidence. She looked grim. Eleanor was sitting in one of the high-backed chairs, her posture completely rigid, staring blankly at a large, unsealed manila envelope resting in the center of the table. The color had completely drained from her face. She looked like she had just seen a ghost. Eleanor, I asked softly, my voice trembling as I stepped into the room. What's wrong? Where are the kids? Maria took them to the library, Eleanor whispered. Her voice sounded completely hollow, stripped of all its power and authority. She didn't look at me. She kept her eyes locked on the envelope. Ms. Brooks, Victoria said, her tone sharp and devoid of any pleasantries. We received a courier package from Richard's legal counsel 20 minutes ago. A supplementary discovery filing. What is it? I asked, my stomach dropping to the floor. I walked closer to the table, my eyes darting between the lawyer and the woman I loved. Did he do something? Because I just ran into him at the market and he tried to offer me. He isn't relying on your testimony anymore, Harper, Eleanor interrupted, her voice cracking as she finally looked up at me. The sheer devastation in her icy blue eyes sent a shockwave of terror straight through my chest. With a trembling hand, Eleanor reached into the manila envelope and pulled out a stack of glossy, high-resolution photographs, scattering them across the polished mahogany table. My breath caught in my throat. They were taken from a distance, utilizing a telephoto lens, but the subjects were unmistakable. It was me and Eleanor. There were photos of us from the porch on the day Richard first confronted me holding her tightly as she cried into my shoulder. But worse, there were photos from 2 nights ago taken through the massive bay window of her study. Curtains had been drawn back just an inch, but it was enough. It was a perfect, damning sequence of images. Me reaching out to touch her arm. Me leaning in. And finally, a crystal-clear, irrefutable photograph of Eleanor Vance and her children's nanny locked in a deeply passionate, undeniable kiss on the leather sofa. "He's been having us followed," Victoria stated coldly, the words dropping like anvils in the quiet room. "He has proof of an inappropriate, subordinate relationship occurring in the same household as the children. He is filing for an emergency custody injunction tomorrow morning, claiming moral turpitude and emotional instability." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The air left my lungs in a violent rush. "Eleanor," I breathed, taking a step toward her. "Don't," Victoria snapped, moving to block my path. She looked at me with absolute, ruthless pragmatism. "The narrative he is building is that Eleanor is a reckless, unfit mother who is carrying on a scandalous affair with the hired help under her children's roof. There is only one way to dismantle this narrative before the judge signs that injunction." I looked at the lawyer, the cold reality of her words sinking in like a knife. "What do you mean?" Eleanor finally stood up. She looked entirely broken, a queen forced to surrender her crown to save her kingdom. She looked at me, tears silently tracking down her pale cheeks. "Victoria is right," Eleanor whispered, her voice shattering my heart into a million pieces. "Harper, you have to leave. Now. Today. And you can never ever come back." End of Part 8. Part 9, The Ultimate Sacrifice. The word hung in the air of the formal dining room, heavy and suffocating as a lead blanket. Leave. I stared at Eleanor, desperately searching her icy blue eyes for any sign that this was a test, a misunderstanding, or a temporary strategic retreat. But all I saw was a vast, echoing devastation. The formidable CEO who commanded empires, the woman who had kissed me with such fierce, undeniable passion in the shadows of the staircase, was entirely gone. In her place sat a terrified mother, utterly broken by a system that was about to be weaponized against her. "Eleanor," I choked out, my voice cracking as I took a step toward the mahogany table. "We can fight this. We knew he was going to play dirty. We can explain the photos." "Explain them how, Ms. Brooks?" Toria Sterling interrupted, her voice snapping like a whip. She stepped directly into my line of sight, her expression a mask of absolute, ruthless pragmatism. "Will you explain to a conservative family court judge that you are engaging in a clandestine romance with your employer while actively caring for her vulnerable children? Richard's narrative is already written. Eleanor is an emotionally unstable woman substituting professional childcare for a scandalous affair. If you are in this house when that emergency injunction is filed tomorrow morning, he will win. He will take Jackson and Chloe." "No," I argued, my chest heaving as a hot, desperate anger flared in my veins. I looked past the lawyer. "Eleanor, tell her. Tell her we aren't backing down." Eleanor slowly stood up. She looked fragile, as if a strong breeze might shatter her completely. Tears were silently tracking down her pale cheeks, ruining her pristine makeup. She walked around the table, stopping just a few feet away from me. The urge to reach out and pull her into my arms was a physical ache, a burning agony in my chest, but the scattered photographs on the table were a screaming reminder that my touch was currently a weapon Richard was using to destroy her. "Victoria is right, Harper," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling violently. "I would burn the entire world down to keep you. But I cannot sacrifice my children to the flames." The fight drained out of me in an instant. I looked at the tears streaming down her face, at the trembling of her hands, and I knew exactly what she was asking me to do. She wasn't just asking me to leave her house, she was asking me to fall on my sword. She was asking me to be the casualty in this war so her kids could survive. "Okay," I breathed, my own tears finally spilling over, blurring my vision. "Okay, I'll go." Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut, a ragged, agonizing sob escaping her throat. She took a half-step forward, lifting a trembling hand as if to touch my face one last time, but Victoria cleared her throat sharply, a brutal reminder of the surveillance they were likely still under. Eleanor's hand dropped to her side. "I am so sorry, Harper," she choked out. "Don't be," I whispered, forcing a brave, broken smile. "Save them, Eleanor." "Win." I turned on my heel and walked out of the dining room before my resolve could shatter completely. The walk down the hallway to my quarters felt like marching to my own execution. The walls of the beautiful estate, the house I had secretly begun to call home, now felt cold and alien. I pulled my worn duffel bag from the closet and began throwing my meager belongings into it. I didn't bother folding anything. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely zip the canvas closed. I left the expensive cashmere sweater Eleanor had lent me folded neatly on the bed. I didn't belong in this world. Richard had made that abundantly clear. As I swung the heavy bag over my shoulder and walked out into the foyer, my heart stopped entirely. The heavy front doors were open. Maria, the housekeeper, was ushering Jackson and Chloe inside, shaking the rain off their small umbrellas. Jackson stopped dead in his tracks when he saw me standing at the bottom of the grand staircase with my duffel bag. Color instantly drained from his face. Chloe peeked out from behind him, her little brow furrowing in confusion. "Harper?" Jackson asked, his voice small and incredibly vulnerable. "Where are you going? Are we going on a trip?" I dropped the bag onto the marble floor. It landed with a dull, heavy thud that sounded like a coffin sealing shut. I dropped to my knees, bringing myself down to their eye level, fighting back a fresh wave of agonizing tears. "Hey guys," I said, my voice thick and shaky. I have to go away for a little while." "What?" Jackson demanded, stepping forward, his hands balling into tight fists at his sides. "Why? Did Mom fire you? Did you do something wrong?" "No, buddy, no one is mad," I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "It's just some adult stuff came up. Personal things. I have to go take care of them." "You promised," Jackson yelled, the betrayal echoing sharply off the high ceilings of the foyer. His eyes filled with angry, heartbroken tears. "You promised you wouldn't leave like all the other ones. You said we were a team. You're just a liar." The accusation felt like a physical knife twisting in my gut. I wanted to tell him the truth. I wanted to tell him about the photographs, about his father's cruelty, about how much I loved his mother, and how walking out this door was the only way to protect them from being torn apart. But I couldn't. I had to let him hate me. It was the price of loyalty. "I'm so sorry, Jackson," I whispered, reaching out to hug him. He violently shoved my hands away. "Don't touch me. Just go. We don't need you anyway." He turned and ran up the sweeping staircase, his small footsteps pounding like a hammer against my skull. Chloe stood there, crying silently, before Maria gently took her hand and led her away, shooting me a look of deep, sorrowful understanding. I was completely alone in the massive foyer. I picked up my bag, walked out the front doors, and stepped out into the freezing rain. I didn't look back as I drove my beat-up sedan through the massive iron gates for the final time. The next 48 hours were a blur of absolute misery. I had checked into a cheap neon-lit motel on the outskirts of the city. The contrast between my dingy, damp room and Eleanor's million-dollar estate was a cruel joke. I barely slept. I barely ate. I spent every waking second staring at my phone, desperately refreshing the local legal and business news streams, looking for any update on the Vance custody hearing. Victoria had forbidden any contact. I was entirely in the dark. By the third evening, I was going out of my mind. The rain was still lashing against the thin glass of the motel window. I grabbed the damp jacket I had been wearing the day I left, intending to go find a vending machine for dinner. As I thrust my hands into the pockets, my fingers brushed against something thick and textured. I pulled my hand out. Resting in my palm were the torn, shredded pieces of the $250,000 check Richard had tried to bribe me with in the parking garage. I had completely forgotten about them in the chaos of my departure. I sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, staring at the torn paper. "Everybody has a price, Harper," Richard's arrogant voice echoed in my memory. "Eleanor is a sinking ship." Why had he offered me $250,000? Yes, to get me out of the picture, but why that specific, exorbitant amount? And more importantly, why had he written a personal check on the spot instead of having his lawyers draft a settlement? Frowning, I carefully arranged the ripped pieces of the check on the cheap Formica nightstand, piecing them together like a puzzle. Pay to the order of Harper Brooks. $250,000. Signed, Richard Vance. But it was the top left corner of the check that made my blood freeze. It wasn't a personal bank account. The name printed at the top read, Aegis Global Holdings LLC. I grabbed my laptop, flipping it open and connecting to the agonizingly slow motel Wi-Fi. I typed the company name into the search engine. First few results were standard, empty corporate websites. But as I dug deeper, filtering through European financial registries and obscure business forums, a very different picture began to emerge. Aegis Global Holdings wasn't a successful venture capital firm. It was a shell company. And according to a leaked financial audit from a regulatory agency in London, it was currently under investigation for massive corporate fraud, embezzlement, and a staggering mountain of hidden debt. I stared at the screen, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. "I need her signature on some asset restructuring documents," Richard had said on the porch that day. "He wants to leverage them, so I will hand over a larger percentage of my shares," Eleanor had told me in the study. Richard wasn't moving back to the States because he missed his kids. He wasn't fighting for custody because he thought Eleanor was an unfit mother. Richard was completely, utterly bankrupt. He was running from European creditors. The only way he could save himself from prison or worse was to gain access to the massive trust funds Eleanor had set up for Jackson and Chloe, or to force Eleanor to buy him out of his custody rights for millions of dollars in company shares. He was using his own children as financial hostages. If the family court judge knew that Richard was under active investigation for fraud and seeking custody purely for financial extortion, the photographs of Eleanor and me wouldn't matter. The judge would throw Richard's case out instantly. I looked at the clock. It was 11:30 p.m. The emergency custody injunction hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. the following morning. I picked up my phone and dialed the number on the business card Victoria Sterling had aggressively shoved into my hand my first week on the job. It rang 4 times before a sharp, irritated voice answered. "Sterling." "Victoria," I said, my voice steady, filled with a dangerous, newfound adrenaline. "It's Harper." "Miss Brooks," the lawyer hissed, her tone venomous. "I explicitly told you." "Shut up and listen to me," I commanded, completely dropping my polite deference. "I have the silver bullet. I know why Richard is doing this, and I have the evidence to prove it. He's bankrupt, Victoria. He's under investigation for fraud in London. He's after the children's trust funds. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. The terrifying lawyer was actually speechless. How do you know this? Victoria finally asked, her tone shifting from irritated to sharply predatory. Because the idiot tried to bribe me with a check from a fraudulent shell company, I said, looking down at the taped pieces of paper on the nightstand. I have the account and routing numbers. If you run a deep forensic trace on this LLC tonight, you'll have everything you need to destroy him in court tomorrow. Send me a photograph of the check immediately, Victoria demanded, the thrill of the kill evident in her voice. If this is true, Harper, you just saved her. I know, I said quietly. I snapped a picture of the reconstructed check, hit send, and tossed the phone onto the bed. I walked over to the tiny, cracked mirror above the sink and stared at my reflection. I looked exhausted, pale, and completely battered. But the fire in my eyes was back. Eleanor had told me I had to leave to protect her children. But she was wrong. Running away wasn't the answer. Fighting was. I wasn't going to sit in this dingy motel room while the woman I loved fought for her life in a courtroom. I grabbed my blazer off the chair. I had a court date to attend. End of Part 9. Part 10, The Unbreakable Bond. The heavy, imposing marble floors of the county family courthouse echoed with the sharp clicks of expensive shoes and the low, tense hum of anxious murmurs. It was 8:45 a.m. The air inside the building felt stale and suffocating, thick with the weight of shattered families and bitter legal wars. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors, my damp blazer clinging slightly to my shoulders. I hadn't slept a single minute, but the sheer, blinding adrenaline coursing through my veins made me feel completely invincible. I scanned the crowded, fluorescent-lit corridor, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. And then I saw her. Eleanor was standing near the towering oak doors of Courtroom 4B. She was dressed in a formidable razor-sharp charcoal suit, her dark hair pulled back into her signature immaculate chignon. To a stranger, she looked like an untouchable, emotionless corporate titan. But I knew her. I saw the slight tremor in her hands as she clutched her designer briefcase. I saw the devastating exhaustion bruising the delicate skin beneath her icy blue eyes. She looked like a woman walking to the gallows. Next to her stood Victoria Sterling, looking like a shark that had just smelled a drop of blood in the water. I took a deep breath and began walking toward them. Crowds seemed to part, the noise fading into a dull roar. Eleanor looked up. When her eyes locked onto mine, the world stopped spinning. The breath visibly left her lungs, her lips parting in sheer, unadulterated shock. For a terrifying second, I thought she might actually collapse. "Harper," Eleanor breathed, taking a half-step forward, completely abandoning her poised posture. What are you doing here? I told you to stay away. If Richard sees you..." "Let him see me," I interrupted, my voice steady, filled with a quiet, undeniable ferocity. I closed the distance between us, stopping just inches away from her. The overwhelming urge to pull her into my arms was agonizing, but I kept my hands firmly at my sides. "I'm not letting you walk into that room alone, Eleanor. I told you we're a team. We fight together." "Miss Brooks," Victoria said, stepping smoothly between us. Unlike Eleanor, the lawyer was smiling, a terrifying, predatory grin that sent a shiver down my spine. She reached into her leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavily tabbed file. "Your timing is impeccably dramatic. The forensic accounting team worked through the night. The wire transfers, the hidden debts, the offshore shell companies, it is a masterpiece of corporate fraud. We have everything." Before Eleanor could ask what Victoria meant, the heavy courtroom doors swung open. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Marcus Thorne," the bailiff bellowed. "Showtime," Victoria whispered, her eyes gleaming. She looked at me. "Take a seat in the gallery, Harper. Watch how a professional dismantles a parasite." I slipped into the back row of the wooden gallery benches just as Richard Vance swaggered down the center aisle. He was flanked by two sleazy-looking, high-priced attorneys. He looked smug, victorious, and entirely oblivious to the absolute hellfire that was about to rain down upon his head. He shot a sneering glance at Eleanor, who sat rigidly at the defense table, but his smirk faltered slightly when he noticed me sitting in the back. The judge, a stern-looking man with silver hair, adjusted his glasses and looked down at the massive stack of papers before him. "We are here regarding an emergency injunction for temporary sole custody, filed by the petitioner Richard Vance," Judge Thorne stated, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "Counsel, proceed." Richard's lead attorney stood up, buttoning his expensive suit. "Your Honor, we are filing this emergency injunction out of deep concern for the moral and emotional well-being of the minor children. Ms. Vance has demonstrated a shocking lack of judgment. She works erratic, excessive hours, completely outsourcing the raising of her children. But more disturbingly, Your Honor, we have photographic evidence that Ms. Vance is currently engaging in a highly inappropriate romantic relationship with the children's nanny inside the family home." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Richard leaned back in his chair, folding his arms, looking entirely pleased with himself. "We submit these photographs to the court," the sleazy lawyer continued, holding up the damning manila envelope. "They clearly show Ms. Vance prioritizing a scandalous affair over the stability of her household. We request immediate physical custody be transferred to the father to remove the children from this toxic environment." The judge frowned, extending a hand to accept the envelope. "Objection, Your Honor!" Victoria Sterling's voice sliced through the air like a perfectly sharpened guillotine blade. She stood up slowly, radiating an aura of absolute dominance. "The petitioner's argument is entirely built on a foundation of malicious, fabricated outrage designed to mask his true motive, financial extortion." Richard's smirk instantly vanished. His attorney scoffed. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous." "What is ridiculous?" Victoria projected, her voice commanding every ounce of attention in the room, "is that the petitioner is attempting to use this family court to evade international law enforcement. Your Honor, I present Defense Exhibit A." Victoria confidently marched toward the judge's bench, handing over a thick, bound dossier. "Last night, defense counsel was made aware of an attempted bribe directed at my client's employee, Ms. Harper Brooks," Victoria stated, turning to look directly at Richard. Color began to rapidly drain from his perfectly tanned face. "The petitioner offered Ms. Brooks $250,000 to abandon her post and commit perjury. Fortunately, Ms. Brooks is a woman of high moral character. She rejected the bribe but retained the torn check." Courtroom fell deathly silent. Eleanor turned her head, looking at me in the back row with wide, disbelieving eyes. I offered her a tiny, reassuring nod. "The check," Victoria continued, her voice echoing off the mahogany walls, "was drafted from an LLC named Aegis Global Holdings. Overnight forensic analysis has confirmed that this LLC is a fraudulent shell company currently under active investigation by the British Financial Conduct Authority for massive embezzlement. Richard Vance is not a concerned father, Your Honor. He is entirely bankrupt. He is facing imminent criminal indictment in Europe, and he filed this emergency custody petition solely to gain access to his children's multi-million-dollar trust funds to pay off his illegal debts." Chaos erupted. Richard leaped out of his chair, his face contorted in a mask of ugly, desperate fury. "That's a lie. She's lying. This is a setup, Your Honor." "Sit down, Mr. Vance," Judge Thorne roared, slamming his gavel down so hard the sound cracked through the air like a gunshot. The judge frantically flipped through the dossier Victoria had provided. He read the forensic accounting summary, the copies of the forged LLC documents, and the pending European investigative notices. The stern lines on the judge's face deepened into an expression of absolute disgust. He looked up, glaring down at Richard and his suddenly panicked attorneys. "Mr. Vance," the judge said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low register, "this court does not take kindly to being weaponized for corporate fraud and extortion. Your emergency petition for custody is hereby denied with extreme prejudice. Furthermore, I am granting Ms. Vance a permanent restraining order." You are to have zero contact with her, her household staff, or the minor children. I will also be forwarding defense counsel's findings to the federal authorities for immediate review. Richard stood entirely frozen, looking like a man who had just been hit by a freight train. His own lawyers were already backing away from him, desperately trying to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. This hearing is adjourned, the judge declared, striking the gavel one final time. It was over. In less than 20 minutes, the nightmare that had terrorized Eleanor for weeks was completely eradicated. I didn't wait for the courtroom to clear. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the quiet corridor, my knees suddenly feeling incredibly weak as the adrenaline began to rapidly leave my system. I leaned back against the cool marble wall, closing my eyes, letting out a long, shuddering breath. We did it. They were safe. Harper! The sound of my name, laced with overwhelming desperation, echoed down the hall. I opened my eyes just in time to see Eleanor sprinting toward me. She had left her briefcase and her lawyer behind. The formidable CEO armor was completely shattered, leaving behind only the woman I loved. She crashed into me with the force of a tidal wave. I caught her, wrapping my arms fiercely around her waist, burying my face in the crook of her neck. Eleanor threw her arms around my shoulders, clinging to me as if I were the only solid object in the universe. She was crying, not tears of terror or exhaustion, but tears of profound, overwhelming relief. You came back, she sobbed into my shoulder, her fingers gripping the fabric of my blazer. You saved us. You saved my family. I told you I wasn't going anywhere, I whispered, holding her tighter, inhaling the familiar, intoxicating scent of jasmine and sandalwood. I'm right here, Eleanor. I'm right here. We stood in the courthouse hallway holding each other for a long time, completely oblivious to the lawyers and clerks walking past us. The photographs didn't matter anymore. The secret was out, the threat was neutralized, and we were finally wonderfully free. The drive back to the estate felt entirely different than the drive away. The sun had broken through the heavy storm clouds, casting a bright golden light over the sprawling lawns and the massive iron gates. When Eleanor and I walked through the front doors, the house felt lighter. The oppressive, suffocating tension that had haunted the hallways for weeks was entirely gone. Mom! Jackson and Chloe came barreling down the sweeping staircase. Eleanor dropped her purse and caught them both, falling to her knees on the marble floor to pull them into a massive, desperate hug. She kissed the tops of their heads, tears shining in her eyes once again. Over Eleanor's shoulder, Jackson's eyes found mine. He froze for a second, his 10-year-old brain processing the fact that I was standing in his foyer again. The anger and betrayal that had contorted his face when I left were entirely gone. He pulled away from his mother and walked slowly toward me. He looked down at his shoes, shuffling his feet awkwardly. I'm sorry I yelled at you, Jackson mumbled, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't mean it. I thought you lied to us. I dropped down to one knee, putting myself at his eye level. I reached out and gently squeezed his shoulder. I know you didn't mean it, buddy. And I'm sorry I had to leave like that. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. But I promise you, I am never walking out that door again unless you and your sister are coming with me. We're a team, remember? Jackson looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears, and threw his arms around my neck, hugging me fiercely. Chloe immediately ran over and joined the pile, nearly knocking me over onto the marble floor. I held them both, my heart swelling with a kind of love I had never anticipated finding when I first answered that desperate nanny ad. I looked up and caught Eleanor's gaze. She was watching us from the floor, a beautiful, radiant smile illuminating her face. For the first time since I met her, she looked truly, completely happy. Later that evening, after the children were successfully tucked into bed and the massive estate had settled into a peaceful, comforting silence, I walked into Eleanor's study. The single desk lamp was glowing softly, casting warm shadows across the leather furniture. Eleanor was standing by the bay window, looking out over the moonlit gardens. She had changed into a pair of soft silk pajama pants and a loose white tank top. Without the sharp suits and the terrifying lawyers, she looked heartbreakingly beautiful. I walked up behind her, gently wrapping my arms around her waist, pulling her back against my chest. She immediately melted into my embrace, letting out a soft, contented sigh and resting her head back against my shoulder. "So," I murmured, pressing a soft kiss to the side of her neck, feeling her pulse jump against my lips. "Where do we go from here? Am I officially fired as your household manager?" Eleanor laughed, a genuine musical sound that sent a thrill of joy straight to my core. She turned around in my arms, resting her hands flat against my chest, looking up at me with those brilliant, intoxicating icy blue eyes. "You are absolutely unequivocally fired from being my employee," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a soft, husky whisper. Teasing light in her eyes faded into something deep, intense, and profoundly passionate. "Because I don't want you living in the guest quarters anymore, Harper. I want you up here, with me, as my partner, for as long as you will have me." My breath hitched. The absolute certainty in her voice erased any lingering doubts I had about our future. We had survived the fire, and we had forged something unbreakable in the flames. "That sounds like a terrible business decision, Ms. Vance," I smiled, tangling my fingers into her soft, dark hair. "It's the best decision I've ever made," she whispered, pulling my face down to hers. Our lips met in a slow, breathtakingly tender kiss. There was no fear left. There was no hesitation, no hiding in the shadows of the staircase, no terrifying threat looming over our heads. It was just us. I pulled her flush against my body, deepening the kiss, completely losing myself in the taste of her, in the warmth of her skin, and in the overwhelming, undeniable truth that I had finally found my home. End of story. Wow, just wow. Take a deep breath with me, everyone, because that was an absolute roller coaster of emotions. Hey, beautiful people, it's your GL girlfriend here. Before we do anything else, I just want to say a massive, massive thank you for sticking with me all the way to the end of this incredible 10-part story. Let's just sit down, grab a coffee or some tea, and unpack everything that just happened because my heart is still racing. First of all, can we talk about the sheer, undeniable tension between Harper and Eleanor? The whole icequeen CEO melts for the sunny, unbreakable nanny dynamic is just absolute perfection. From that very first moment when Harper had a bucket of freezing water dumped on her head and just laughed, to the absolute fireworks in the dim kitchen, the chemistry was off the charts. But what I really loved about this story wasn't just the romance, it was the intense stakes. Eleanor was wearing this heavy, impenetrable corporate armor because she was terrified. She was a mother trying to protect her kids from a system and a man that wanted to tear them down. And let's be real, we all absolutely hated Richard, right? Every single time that man walked on screen, I wanted to throw my phone. He represented that ultimate toxic threat, not just to Eleanor and Harper's relationship, but to Eleanor's entire world. And then that twist. Oh my gosh, when Harper found the ripped pieces of that $250,000 check and pieced together that Aegis Global Holdings was a fraudulent shell company. Literal chills. Harper proved that she wasn't just a nanny and she wasn't just a lover, she was a protector. She walked into that courthouse and completely flipped the script. Seeing Eleanor finally drop her guard, finally realize she didn't have to fight the whole world alone was just so deeply satisfying. And Jackson and Chloe finally getting the safe, loving, blended family they deserved. I'm not crying, you're crying. But enough about me analyzing it, I want to hear from you. Let's get a conversation going in the comments right now. I have so many questions for you guys. First, did you see that twist with Richard coming, or did the bankruptcy in the shell company completely catch you off guard? Second, what was your absolute favorite moment between Harper and Eleanor? Was it the necklace scene before the gala? The rainy kitchen kiss? Or that dramatic courthouse reunion? Let me know your favorite scene down below. And finally, what kind of tropes do you want to see next on this channel? Enemies to lovers? Fake dating? Best friends to lovers? Tell me what your heart wants. If this story made your heart flutter, please do me a huge favor and smash that like button. Really helps the channel grow so I can keep bringing you more amazing, high-quality GL stories. And if you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on those notification bells so you never miss a new upload from your GL girlfriend. You guys are the absolute best, most supportive community on this platform, and I appreciate every single like, comment, and view. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for loving Harper and Eleanor as much as I did, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye.